little too little sleep. And so today, many of us, whether in this place or at home, are trying to make sense of Christmas. For example, Mixmas is over. As we talked about last week, 12:01, the morning of the 26th, Mixmas comes to an end. You're on your own if you want to listen to Christmas music now. No more 94.5 to help you out. 96.9 is no longer DJ'd by Santa. It's back to whoever the regular disc jockey is. And that abrupt transition leaves so many of us trying to make sense of this time. All of this preparation, all of this decoration, recipes that only come out once a year, special sweaters and outfits and all sorts of special things in our homes and in our calendars have run their course. And so now we find ourselves trying to make sense of it all. By midday on the 26th, only the church-related television channels were still running Christmas programming, with the obvious exception of Hallmark, which will run those syrupy Christmas movies 45 weeks out of the new year. So if you want to catch one of those, that's still available to you. But we who gather in this place and in places like it, those who gather for worship on this Sunday after Christmas Day, we are saying that this time is somehow different. We mark it differently on our calendars, daring to say that Christmas Day, that 24-hour period, is more than just one day. It is, in fact, the beginning of an entire season, 12 days of Christmas. Christians for generations and in all different parts of the world have marked off this season to celebrate something amazing in our world. And in our hearts, our souls, our being, our ways of living, we say that this day and this season mean something else. The arrival of the Christ child is greater than the arrival even of Santa Claus, or relatives, or traditions, or decorations, or Christmas sweaters. It means something more. And now that the day is behind us, and now that there are only, 361 or 2 days until next Christmas, many of us are trying to make sense of what this all really means. The question I'd like to ask of you this morning is similar to the question that we ask on our service days in the community. How is this different for us? For example, a year or two ago, several of us gathered here. It was an intergenerational meeting. We went to different work sites, different locations, and one of the work sites that day was the firehouse across the street. We took food, we had conversation, and when we got back here to the church house, we entertained the question, how is what we just did any different from the local service club, for example, or the local civic club, who simply wants to go and do a good deed in the community? The question we ask today on the first Sunday of the Christmas season is a similar one. How is our celebration of Christmas any different? What makes our observance of the Christmas season different from what you might hear piped in over the radio as you walk through the craziness at Fayette Mall? How is today different? Galatians chapter 4 is one of the places that the New Testament answers this type of question. And for those of us who are familiar with Jesus spending a tremendous amount of time and energy saying to people who would otherwise be considered outsiders that they are welcome, this passage may be surprising. Again and again throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus surprising those who would say that he should not spend time with sinners, for example. He has a reputation as a glutton and a wine bibber. He has a reputation as one who will spend time with sinners and tax collectors. And yet Jesus is always making the point clearly. A Samaritan is a hero of a story. A woman who is so accustomed to being excluded that she makes her way to the well at the heat of the day is someone that he invests his time in. But by contrast, this passage from Galatians chapter 4, as sharply as any place you'll find in Scripture, makes a distinction between those who are outsiders and those who are insiders. In this particular case, the context is clear. Those who are outsiders include anyone who sees the law as the pathway to righteousness. Those who are insiders are they who proclaim Jesus as Lord. Others have picked up on this sort of dichotomy between outsiders and insiders. We've talked about C.S. Lewis' little essay before. You remember the one where he pretends to be an ancient philosopher historian who is observing different cultures of Western civilization and turns his attention to the island nation of Niaturb. Spell Niaturb backwards and you get Britain. He talks about how in the month of December, the residents of Niaturb rush about in what they call the Xmas rush. Part of what they do is send greeting cards to one another, and there's this ritual that if you receive a card from someone that you've already sent a card to, you celebrate your good fortune. But if you receive a card from someone to whom you had not sent a card, you curse that day and rush back out into the Xmas rush to purchase a card and send it off. The day of Xmas, Lewis writes, is a somber day, prone to overindulgence and misery. But curiously, Lewis writes that all the while there is another group, a smaller group, that celebrates another holiday, a different holiday, on the same day as Xmas. And this smaller group celebrates Christmas. These are people who wake on Christmas morning with joy in their hearts, make their way to holy places, houses of worship, and when they report on their experience of that day, it is one of peace and joy. Today's generation, a very popular novelist named James Patterson has written a Christmas book called Santa Kid, in which Santa and Mrs. Claus have a little girl, and she is Santa Kid, and she saves Christmas from the corporate executive who tries to buy out the North Pole and rename it the Xmas Express. You get the idea. There are those, Galatians and others suggest, who look at this day very differently than we who gather here. How is our Christmas different? For starters, Galatians says, we are people who need to be redeemed. Now, that word redeemed, redemption, is a heady word. It's sometimes hard to define. Let's see what the book of Galatians means by that word. If we back up to verse 1 of chapter 4, we see a little bit more of the context. The apostle here is talking about a legal transition. It's not unlike the legal transition that we mark by things like a driver's license or the right to vote. A legal transition from one who is a minor and therefore having very few rights to one who is considered legally an adult. But in this particular setting that the apostle is describing, that transition is marked by the terms of the Father. The Father is the one who states when the minor is able to be considered an adult. Specifically, the father gets to dictate when the minor becomes of age and therefore is eligible to receive an inheritance. To be clear, this is not a transition that happens by right with maturity. Now, we all know examples of celebrities or others who at a young age receive some sort of inheritance, some sort of responsibility for which they are simply unprepared, not ready, too immature. And we all know people who behave with great immaturity despite their agedness. No, this transition from minor to adult is not a right that happens with maturity. It is instead a privilege that happens only due to the direct intervention of the Father. The terms of the Father mark that transition. In our passage today, verses 4 and 5, the apostle continues. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent God's Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. The beginning of verse 5 is where we find that word redeem or redemption. And it is a very special word. This is the Greek word that is used for a technical term for this legal process that a slave might go through in order to purchase his freedom. Literally, the apostle is saying that God gives us, through Jesus Christ, the opportunity to purchase our freedom, or that our freedom has been purchased by the arrival of Jesus on the scene. If I might paraphrase this passage, God sent God's Son in order to purchase our freedom and adopt us as children. That's how Christmas is different for us. The passing of presents and the singing of carols may sound very similar. The front walk of your house may look very similar to someone who lives down the street and is not in a house of worship today. But for the Christian, we are celebrating that the arrival of the Christ child purchases our freedom from the slavery that we have made for ourselves. There's just one problem. When I look in the mirror, I see something very different than the person the apostle is hoping to see. When I look in the mirror, sometimes I see someone who still thinks of himself as a slave. When I look in the mirror, I still see someone who can have a faith that is more about coercion than it is about joy. Other times I may look in the mirror and see someone who would still behave as if still a child. One who enjoys all privilege and wants no responsibility. I'm reminded of another letter in which the apostle asks the childlike question, shall we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? Some of us know people for whom the birth and the sacrifice, the life, the teaching, the example of Jesus Christ are all excuses to be able to live however we please. Well, Jesus died for me, so I'm covered. And I can live any old way I please. No, the apostle is describing what it would be like to look in the mirror and see someone for whom the Son of God has purchased my freedom so that I can be adopted and join in the same inheritance that Jesus himself receives as full heir to the promise. Paducah legend Irvin Cobb wrote a story 100 years ago about a mountain feud. Fictional, of course. A mountain feud between two clans, the Dugmores and the Tranthams. Some of you know this story. Ance Dugmore had lived his entire life free of the feud. In fact, nobody in his immediate household had been touched by this feud. It was all cousins up on another ridge who for generations had passed this tradition down. Then one day as he was working in the land, he received word that 3 men in his immediate family had been killed, murdered in this clan rivalry. And so as he had been trained to do years before, he started off on foot, grabbed his rifle, and set out that very moment to seek revenge. He walked for 2 days, waited and watched for 2 more, until that moment came when he was able to murder in cold blood a cousin on the other side of the feud. It wasn't long before Ance found himself on a train heading off to the old state penitentiary, state prison at Frankfort. He spent 4 years in a 7-by-7-by-3 cell. Not surprisingly, he contracted tuberculosis. And that's the condition that a new governor found him in when he decided it would be wise as a new governor to tour the state prison in Frankfort. The governor looked out on the yard. It was wintertime, and that meant one 15-minute break in the middle of the day for the prisoners. And his eye fell upon Ance and began to ask questions about him. Was he a well-behaved prisoner? Well, yes, but that doesn't really matter. He only has moments left to live. And so the governor pardoned him. The governor decided he had served enough of his sentence as a prisoner, and he pardoned him. The next was a chilling scene in Cobb's story. The warden calls in Ance Dugmore and shares the news that his sentence has been pardoned by the governor. No response from Dugmore. Silence, but a light in his eyes, across his face, showed that he understood what had been said. The warden spoke again. "You've been pardoned." To which Dugmore replied, "I heard you the first time. When can I go?" The warden was taken aback. "You mean to tell me that the governor has come down and decided that your time has been filled and you're free to go, and that's all you have to say?" To which Dugmore replied, "I said, when can I go?" Just a few moments later, he was on the train, making his way back up into the hills. When he got home, he learned that in the 4 years he'd been away, the feud had been entirely one-sided. Almost all of his people were gone, save for one distant cousin who that very night was making preparation to leave the next morning to go several counties over to start anew, get away from that feud once and for all, and start a new life altogether. So Dugmore had a choice that night: to join his cousin and go over the mountains and try to live the rest of his days in a new way, or to rejoin his family legacy and step back into the feud. The story ends. Ance his body full of tuberculosis, on the side of a mountain, waiting in ambush for the patriarch of the Trantham clan, rifle in hand, to the bitter end. In that story, it was in the fullness of time from the governor's perspective that Doug Moore's freedom was purchased, given to him. And yet he goes right back to the ways he'd always known. Goes right back to the life he'd always lived. Galatians tells us in chapter 4, it was in the fullness of time that the Christ child came. The Word took on flesh, and our freedom was purchased. We are no longer slaves. We are no longer simply children of God. We are intended to be adopted, full joint heirs in the inheritance that Jesus himself receives from the Holy One. Now, following Jesus is a way of life. Being an heir means taking on responsibility for what we inherit. And herein lies the heart of our question today. What makes our Christmas different? Is it merely a hectic time on the calendar and a busy time in my spirit? Or is it a glimpse, a foretaste, a first fruit of that new direction that is slowly reshaping my very existence? The choice is ours. Is something new born in you this season? Is something familiar reborn in you? Something long forgotten, a possibility that once glimmered for you and was rejected. Galatians would remind us today, the Christ child has come and purchased our freedom, made us children so that if we would choose to live into that promise, we would be full heirs, jointly in the inheritance of the holy with God's Son, Jesus Christ. If you want to receive that inheritance today, live into that promise and accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. We want to give an opportunity to do that. If you need help praying that prayer, if you need help inviting Jesus into your heart, then please come forward as we sing this next song, or please stay after the service and let's talk. If you're someone who has uttered some words and needs to share that decision, you've prayed on Christmas Eve, or you prayed Christmas morning, or sometime in your past you made a decision for Christ, but you've never shared that. If today you need to share with this congregation what God is doing in you and through you, we would love to celebrate with you. Or perhaps you realize that you need to come home in a very real sense. Surround yourself with sisters and brothers in Christ. Be connected with this church as a place to minister, a place to serve, a place to worship, people with whom to share your life. We would love to welcome you as members of Georgetown Baptist Church. or if there's another step that you need to take in your spirit, something that you've been holding back from the Holy One, and you need to make this a time, a season of prayer, or you need to share another decision that is on your heart today of ways that you can live into that inheritance. You're no longer willing to settle for being a slave. You're no longer willing to settle simply for being a child. You want to live into the full maturity of the promise. If you are resolved in your spirit to make that kind of decision today, would you come forward as we sing this next song and share that decision with us? We stand now and sing our hymn of response in hopes that you will come.